Okay, so for my article, I had the article Transcending Belief, which deals with spirituality and the positive effect it may or may not have on workplace behavior. So going into the overview, the idea of what the authors of the paper were trying to do is they were looking to test the correlation between spirituality and positive workplace behavior. Really, this article is focusing on how they were trying to make a tool to test this without being invasive or implying in a corporate setting that a certain corporation or company was focused on or was associated with a specific religious entity. So they were worried that previous scales that people had used were too God focused and wouldn't be appropriate for the corporate world. So one of the first things that they ran into was they wanted to define what spirituality was in the first place. And they wanted to come up with ways that they could put into a questionnaire of how they could test for this spirituality without it being God focused or focused on one specific religion. So they decided on using 4 different forms. The first one was religious, and then the second one was spiritual, third one philosophical, and then the last one was psychological. So they thought that those 4 categories would incorporate the many different types and ways that people practice or are involved in spirituality. And the overall goal, like I said, they wanted to create a tool because really nobody previously was able to have a tool that would work at a larger corporate scale without being too heavily religiously focused. So that was what their goal was to make this tool in the first place, and then go on later to bring their defined tool or refined tool, I should say, to a larger scale and test it in a corporate area. So going into the organizing framework, so this is how they started looking at how they were going to set this up. The first dimension that they looked at was the orientations, and I kind of went over those before. It was comprised of religious, spiritual, philosophical, and psychological. And all of these different orientations are thought to aid in the understanding of existence of things, the purpose of living, the difference between right and wrong, and the strategies employed in various life situations. So they thought these 4 different categories really would cover well how people had been ingrained their values and beliefs and certain different things and understanding of the world as a whole. And yeah, morality, difference between right and wrong. Excuse me, those different things. And then the second dimension, they pretty much took the top 4 and then dived into them a little deeper. And then they comprised these elements of the 4 orientations into needs and motivations, beliefs, values, purposes, behaviors and strategies, practices and experiences and states. And they wanted to see which combination of these things, of these elements, would be most successful at predicting positive workplace behavior. So they wanted to see what elements or in what ways people were utilizing these elements or going about satisfying their needs, motivations, those, et cetera, in the workplace, and which of those specifically would be most correlated with this positive workplace behavior. So the next thing they went on was the item development. So once they had the orientations established and then the elements of those orientations, now they wanted to look at, okay, what can we create? What examples can we bring up? What items can we ask people about so we can then go in and test and find those correlations? So for this, they generalized their definitions. So they had more specific results, or they got the results that they're looking at more specifically, and they were eliminating extra things that maybe they could throw in there but wouldn't be beneficial or help tell the story and it would just lead to meaningless data that they would collect. So they wanted to start their studies broadly, from a very broad general standpoint, as in, way out top, big picture view, and then later move into more specific studies. And again, the idea of this whole thing is that they're creating a tool that they can later use on a larger corporate scale in the workplace. So they're starting off big and hoping later on, once they get the big picture settled, they can go in and define it down more. So they decided to focus on differentiating between spiritual, philosophical, and psychological orientations. And then for the elements, they focused on motivations and values, behaviors and practices, and states within those different orientations. So they then went and created a pool of 23 items relating to spiritual values, 19 items relating to spiritual practices, and 19 items relating to spiritual states. They consulted some subject matter experts to come up with these different ideas and examples, and then had other subject matter experts look at them, eliminate some other things, and they kind of got this final list. So then they went into developing the scale. So now they have the orientations that they want to test. They have the elements that they want to test in there. They have the pool of items that are going to go on the questionnaire later on. And now they wanted to figure out, okay, how are we going to put this into a scale where we can test it and find these correlations? So they used this step to validate the scale they chose to use and make corrections to it as needed. So like I said, this is really just at a base level. They're just trying to create this tool to begin with. So they made the first scale, and now they're wanting to use this scale that they have, test it, and go in and refine it more so to create a final product. So they chose undergrad students taking courses in behavior, organizational behavior to test. Big surprise there. And for the students that they tested, most were non-traditional. They worked at least 2 days a week, and the average was 25. Average age was 25. So they thought by doing this, they were going to capture more people who've had workplace experience, as opposed to maybe just traditional students who are just full-time college students and haven't had much experience in the actual corporate setting. So they wanted to have their items in the questionnaire. They wanted to have enough items in their questionnaire to adequately represent the diversity in how people practice their spirituality and their different forms of spirituality, but they didn't want it to be so big that it created meaningless distinctions. So they really wanted to eliminate things off of their scale or off of this questionnaire that they're making that wouldn't have any value, wouldn't add any value to the overall goal that they were trying to achieve. They used a 9-point scale for spiritual values and a 7-point scale for practices and states. So you basically rank 1 through 9. 1, this doesn't pertain to me at all. 9 definitely pertains to me. And same kind of idea for the 7-point scale for the practices and states. And then so going on to the results, motivations and values produced 3 factors: valuing spiritual beliefs and experiences, valuing the achievement of meaning in life through connection and separation from others, and valuing self-examination. So as we're looking at this, the factors that they ended up deciding upon, once they tested them, they found that these 3 factors within motivational values or practices, experiences, states, so we look at those, had the highest potential of being correlated to this positive workplace behavior. So they found that these 3 things had that highest correlation or highest possibility of doing it. And actually in motivational and value, they tested 4 factors, but the 4th one they left out because they found that it basically wasn't correlated. So they cut it out. And then so you move on to practices. Practices, they produce 4 factors. Those being traditional religious and spiritual practices, use of body work to advance spirituality, personal forms of meditation, and the importance of an environment encouraging inner reflection and letting go of things. And then lastly, experiences/states produce 4 factors: achieving a sense of purpose, feeling whole and at peace, having transcendent experiences, and being confused, lost, and afraid of assessing oneself in the world. So from their questionnaire that they gave to the students, these were the factors that they found linked the highest to the possibility of being correlated with positive workplace behavior within the 3 different categories we just went over. So that was the results of the student survey that they got. And then they defined, or maybe redefined, positive workplace behavior actually as self-leadership when they went in to finally look at the correlation. So they defined self-leadership as the process of influencing oneself to establish the self-direction and self-motivation needed to perform a task. And then they broke it down into 5 different elements. First one being personal goal setting. Second one being mental practice. Third one being designing natural rewards for yourself. Fourth one being self-monitoring. And the last one being self-reinforcement. So that's how they define self-leadership. And then the factors that they found ended up being significantly correlated to self-leadership under motivations and values. They found valuing the achievement of peace and love through self-examination was significantly correlated to self-leadership. Makes sense. You know, if you're avidly self-examining yourself, you're probably going to be practicing a lot of the things or a lot of the elements that are within self-leadership. And then under behaviors and practices, they found spending time in an environment that encourages inner reflection and letting go of things to manage boundaries. Again, inner reflection, letting go of things that maybe aren't that big of a deal. You can see how that would be associated well with self-leadership. And then the last one, experiences/states, experiencing a sense of purpose, place, and meaning. And kind of going into what Tommy was looking at in his article, you know, experiencing a sense of purpose and place and meaning within your spirituality. If you have a sense of purpose, you are probably going to be more motivated or more self-motivated, more of a self-leader in the workplace, because you have a reason to what you're doing. You feel like you have a purpose, you have a meaning of doing what you're doing. And so that's pretty much all that the article went over there. So essentially, you know, this is the preliminary test that they did to create this tool or this questionnaire to look at the correlation between these factors and self-leadership in the corporate world. This is where the article ended. Right after the undergrad, it now kind of leads on to how they're going to apply it into the corporate setting, how it's going to be accepted. And that was their overall goal. So that's what I got from my article.